I'm Matt Towery, and I'm welcoming you into my office this afternoon just as a prelude to the talk I'm going to give as a follow-up to my national column, which appears today. Now, this is a bit of a mess because when you collect political memorabilia over the years, you just sort of tend to, after a while, quit putting it in frames. But I thought it important today to show that I had a little bit of knowledge of the people I'm talking about, because the subject of my column is going to be such that you'll have to really wonder about it when I start to talk about it. I want to show you this particular picture. Of course, we have Bill Clinton and we have President Bush, all memorabilia from my years with Newt Gingrich, including the time that I jumped in Newt's lap without him expecting it. But the most interesting thing of all of these things that I've collected, from having known or met Richard Nixon back during the time period that he was no longer president, and I was a graduate student at that time at Cambridge University, having left Capitol Hill to research international relations. But during the time period in the 1980s when I worked on Capitol Hill with Mac Mattingly and worked in Washington and in Atlanta, and then at the same time later as a candidate, I had the privilege many times to meet a gentleman by the name of Ronald Reagan. Now, there are a lot of people who have photographs with Ronald Reagan. Interestingly enough, I obviously changed over the years. This is me when I was very young, a staffer working with Mac Mattingly with Ronald Reagan. And I won't go through all of the different photographs of all of the different political types that we have here. And just to show, however, that I am bipartisan, I can go from everywhere from Newt Gingrich to Hillary Clinton, and everywhere from Hillary Clinton to President Bush, to his father up above, to all the way to Jimmy Carter from Georgia, who I'm sure there's a halo or something shining on his face because he's always got a halo around him. Anyway, I give you this story because in just a moment I'm going to tell you who I think Ronald Reagan would vote for in the Republican primary. Now, I'm not endorsing a candidate. I don't endorse candidates. We poll and we make predictions. But I've been around the Republican Party since 1980. And I've been watching politics since I was much younger. And I know a good thing about the true existence and creation of the Reagan administration, the years prior to it, and the years afterwards. And I'm about to shock you with what I'm going to say. Let's head back in the newsroom, and I'll tell you who I think Ronald Reagan would vote for in the Republican caucus in Iowa. Well, now back from what I call my Museum of Dead Presidents to the studios here at Insider Advantage. I want to talk about my column today that says Ronald Reagan would have voted for Ron Paul. Now let me make it clear. I've not fallen off a truck and hit my head too hard and suddenly become some crazy person. I really put a lot of thought into this column. I also want to explain that I'm not endorsing or supporting Ron Paul. I don't have a dog in the fight either on the Republican or the Democratic side, particularly as a pollster. But I have looked at this race, and I've tried to look at it not as most people do, and that is through the eyes of the national media, who will place a certain spotlight or a certain spin on any given candidate, marginalizing individuals, even such as Mike Huckabee, until Huckabee was able to just burst through the national media's sort of lack of attention on him to become a legitimate candidate. I've looked very carefully at Ron Paul, and while I will admit that there are some portions of his platform that seem extreme, even to me, and some which seem perhaps a little bit nonconformist, and his lack of charisma compared to the actor Ronald Reagan certainly is a substantial difference. Just for the sake of academic debate and for the fun of it, I wanted to talk about why I thought Ronald Reagan, if he were living in Iowa, would vote for Ron Paul for President of the United States. First, the personal side. In 1976, Ronald Reagan, and very few people remember this, was considered to be sort of the crazy man in the Republican Party. He made very extreme statements, and those extreme statements were eschewed by many individuals in the Republican Party who simply could not imagine that an extreme-talking, extraordinarily seemingly conservative candidate could be the party's standard bearer. Gerald Ford was the president who'd healed the nation after Richard Nixon, and Reagan was really considered to be, as I've said before, the red-headed stepchild. In fact, he was despised by the Republican establishment. Now, that didn't change going into the 1980 elections. Ronald Reagan, who had really come out of his shell as a Republican under Barry Goldwater and who campaigned very hard for Goldwater in 1964, was still considered to be sort of the wild man, the cowboy, the person who would say things that no one expected, some things that seemed downright crazy. But nevertheless, he became popular with the people. Now, the difference between Ronald Reagan in 1980 and Ron Paul today is that Ronald Reagan had been governor of a very powerful state, California. He had run for president. He was an actor. He was glamorous, and the media was forced to have to take him seriously. But I want to remind my Republican friends that even going into the late spring of 1980 or prior to that, Gerald Ford said on the record, Ronald Reagan is unelectable. That's what Gerald Ford said about Ronald Reagan. Well, certainly that's said about Ron Paul. So that's the first thing they have in common. But let's talk about some of the other things, some of the areas that Ron Paul talks about, and compare it with Ronald Reagan. Let's get first out of the way Reagan's approach to foreign policy. There is very little doubt for those who are honest about Ronald Reagan. If you go back and read all of the speeches, everything he ever said about the Soviet Union, Reagan said time and time again that the evil empire must fall. But he stressed over and over again the fact that we should not use armed weapons. We should not use battle or fights or wars in order to bring that evil empire to an end. Reagan did not believe in the occupation of foreign nations. He was quoted as saying that many times. Now, that's not to say that in a 9/11 time period, when Iraq was critical, that Reagan might not have made the same decision as George W. Bush. But what it is to say is that his rhetoric and his beliefs when he was running for president, and even while he served as president, were more consistent with Ron Paul than most of the other candidates who are running this year. Let me give you another example, and I think this is something a lot of people forget. When our troops, 241 of them, were killed in a bombing in Lebanon, Reagan made the decision not to go attack Lebanon, not to go invade it, but instead to remove those troops, to leave. His rationale was that our presence there was causing more harm than it was good. And when he had problems from Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, rather than to deploy troops, he dropped several bombs next to a tent next to Gaddafi. Gaddafi wasn't heard from for years later, and in fact is now considered to be an ally of the United States. Now, when you talk about some of the other things that Ron Paul talks about, things that really people consider to be way out there, his concern about the monetary policy, the fact that we don't have a gold standard. Well, let me go back and look at Ronald Reagan and what he had to say about the economy back in 1964 when he first became a Republican. Reagan bemoaned the fact that there was a tremendous amount of gold in Fort Knox, but the United States didn't own any of it. And he was greatly concerned about foreign nations owning U.S. currency. Does that sound familiar? Yes, it sounds a lot like Ron Paul, doesn't it? So you go up and down the list all the way to the whole issue of the Constitution. Reagan constantly talked about a constitutional government. Well, admittedly, Reagan's government grew, but it didn't grow at the rate that some people might have expected. And Reagan continued to talk the rhetoric because he believed it even if those working underneath him weren't always implementing the things that he believed in. Reagan said that the Constitution worked for the American people and that government worked for the American people. And that, in fact, the government should never be larger, it should be smaller because the American people were actually the ones who should decide if it should grow. That was his belief at the beginning. That was his belief at the end. He was, in essence, the strongest, strict constitutionalist president that we've had in our lifetime. Ron Paul also talks about those very same things. One other quick note. When Ronald Reagan was running for president in 1976 and not considered a possibility of beating Gerald Ford, Ron Paul was one of few members of Congress, just a handful, who endorsed Ronald Reagan for president. My guess is Ronald Reagan just might, were he alive today, be willing to return the favor. Interesting. Have a great day.